All right, so Donald Trump is back in the White House for a second term, and we're going to try to figure out what that means for you.
Okay.
For this deep dive, we're looking at an article from NYCPE Insights called What Trump's Return to the White House Could Mean for You.
Yeah.
NYCPE Insights is a platform for financial and accounting professionals.
Right.
It'll be interesting to see what they have to say.
Yeah, it's going to be a wild ride.
For sure. The article starts by pointing out that Trump won this election by a landslide.
He did. He won both the Electoral College and the popular vote, which is pretty rare these days. That kind of mandate gives him a lot of power to push his agenda through.
Yeah, no kidding. It sounds like he's ready to shake things up. The article dives into his economic plan first, which is very America First focused.
Right.
He's promising a booming economy, more jobs,
Yeah.
a thriving middle class.
It's a bold vision.
It is. And to achieve it, he's proposing some really big changes, especially when it comes to taxes and tariffs.
Yeah, these are the kind of policies that could have huge ripple effects across the entire economy.
Exactly. So let's break down these policies one by one, starting with taxes.
Okay.
It sounds like Trump is planning round 2 of those big tax cuts from his first term.
He is. He wants to make the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the PCJA, permanent. But he's not stopping there. He's talking about even deeper cuts to corporate tax rates.
Really?
Eliminating taxes on things like tips, Social Security benefits.
Wow.
Even overtime pay. There's even been talk of making certain professions completely tax-free.
Like who?
Like police officers, firefighters, military personnel.
Wow, that's a lot to take in. What's the logic behind all these massive tax cuts?
Well, Trump's argument is that putting more money directly into people's pockets will stimulate the economy.
Right.
He believes it will make everything more affordable, from housing and groceries to cars.
That sounds pretty appealing on the surface, but
It does.
what about the deficit?
Right, that's the big question. The article mentioned a pretty huge number, trillions of dollars added to the national debt.
Yeah, it was something like $5.8 trillion.
The Penn-Wharton budget model estimates that making the TCJA cuts permanent and adding these new ones could add $5.8 trillion to the deficit over the next 10 years.
Wow, I'm no economist, but that sounds like a recipe for disaster. How can we afford that kind of debt?
Well, supporters of these tax cuts argue that they'll trigger such massive economic growth that they'll essentially pay for themselves.
Oh, so it's the classic trickle-down economics argument.
Exactly. Cut taxes for businesses, and the wealthy and the benefits will eventually trickle down to everyone else.
So it's a gamble, hoping that the economic boost will offset the huge loss in tax revenue.
It is, and economists have been debating the merits of trickle-down economics for decades.
Right.
Critics are very skeptical. They argue that we've seen this play out before, and the promised economic boom often fails to materialize.
And then what happened?
Then we end up with a bigger deficit and potentially less revenue to fund essential services like healthcare and education.
Okay, so on the one hand, we have the promise of lower taxes and more money in your pocket. But on the other hand, we have the risk of massive debt and potential cuts to important services.
It's a tough trade-off.
It is. It is. And speaking of economic impacts,
Yeah.
let's talk about tariffs. This is another area where Trump seems ready to make some bold moves.
Right.
The article mentions a blanket 20% tariff on all imports.
Yeah.
Like, what's the reasoning behind that?
Well, Trump is framing it as a way to protect American jobs and businesses from foreign competition.
Okay.
He believes that by making imports more expensive, people will be more likely to buy American-made products, boosting domestic industries.
I can see the appeal of that. But
Yeah.
wouldn't that also mean higher prices for consumers?
That's the big concern. Critics argue that these tariffs will just make everyday goods more expensive for everyone.
Right. Like, what kind of things are we talking about here?
Everything. Clothes, electronics, food, cars.
Wow.
We're talking about everything.
The article mentioned a specific figure about how much these tariffs could add to the average household's expenses. Do you remember what that was?
Yeah. Economists estimate that a 20% tariff could add an extra $2,600 to household spending each year.
$2,600. That's a lot.
It is. That's not a small amount, especially for families already struggling to make ends meet.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And I imagine it would impact different income levels differently, too.
Absolutely. Lower-income households who spend a larger proportion of their income on basic necessities
Right.
would feel the pinch of these tariffs much more acutely.
Okay, so we're talking about potential economic growth on the one hand, but also the risk of inflation and a squeeze on household budgets on the other.
It's a delicate balancing act, and it's really difficult to predict the ultimate outcome.
Yeah.
But one thing's for sure, these tariffs are a major gamble with potentially far-reaching consequences.
And it's not just about the impact on individual consumers, right?
Right.
What about the broader economy?
The International Monetary Fund, the IMF,
Okay.
predicts that Trump's tariffs, especially those targeting China and Europe,
Mm-hmm.
could actually shrink the U.S. economy by 0.8% of GDP in 2025.
0.8%.
And those negative effects could linger for years.
So it's not just about higher prices at the store. It's about a potential slowdown in the entire economy.
Exactly. And that slowdown could impact everything from job growth to investment. It's a complex web of interconnected factors.
It is. So just to recap, we've got tax cuts, which could boost the economy, but also lead to massive debt.
Right.
And we've got tariffs, which could protect American jobs,
Yeah.
but also trigger inflation and a potential recession.
It's a lot to wrap your head around, and these are just two of the major policy changes Trump's proposing.
Right.
There's a lot more to unpack, including his plans for the IRS and his vision for foreign policy.
Okay, well, let's take a deep breath and dive into those topics next.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, so we're just talking about some of Trump's economic plans, which, to be honest, sound like a bit of a gamble.
Yeah.
Let's move on now and talk about his approach to the IRS.
Okay.
I remember during the campaign, he was really vocal about wanting to cut their budget.
He wasn't happy about the $80 billion boost the IRS got under the Inflation Reduction Act.
Right.
That money was supposed to help modernize their systems and increase their enforcement efforts, especially audits on higher income earners.
Yeah.
But Trump sees it as wasteful spending, and he wants to undo those increases.
So fewer audits for everyone. I mean, that
Yeah.
might sound good to some people,
Right?
but I have a feeling there's some downsides too.
Yeah, definitely.
Hmm.
While fewer audits might sound appealing at first, it could create some major headaches, especially for accounting professionals.
Like me.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, so how could IRS budget cuts affect my work?
Well, think about it. A lot of what accountants do hinges on the IRS functioning smoothly.
Okay.
Timely audits, smooth filing processes, getting quick answers to questions.
Uh-huh.
All of that relies on the IRS having enough resources.
That's true.
If they're short-staffed and their budget gets slashed, everything could grind to a halt.
So we're talking about longer wait times, a backlog of unresolved issues, just general chaos. Yeah. And remember, the IRS was in the middle of some major modernization efforts, too.
Oh, right, like that new direct file tax prep program.
Yeah, exactly. What happens to those initiatives if the budget gets cut?
Good point.
It's not looking good. Those modernization efforts will likely face major delays.
I see.
Or worse, get scrapped altogether.
Because you need the resources.
Exactly. You need resources to overhaul outdated systems and implement new programs.
Yeah.
Cutting the IRS budget could basically sabotage their ability to modernize, which ironically could make things even less efficient in the long run.
So penny wise and pound foolish.
Exactly. And these potential changes to the IRS are just one piece of the puzzle.
Trump's second term is shaping up to be a time of major shifts, and perhaps nowhere more so than in foreign policy.
Yeah, that was a big part of his platform, America First and all that. It sounds like he's ready to shake things up on the world stage.
Yeah.
The article mentioned some pretty dramatic changes, like cutting military aid to Ukraine and rethinking our involvement in NATO. Yeah, those are some significant departures from how things have been done. You know, Trump has long been critical of NATO members for not contributing enough financially. He argues that the U.S. shoulders too much of the burden.
Right.
He's even suggested that we might withdraw our support if allies don't pay their fair share.
And what about the conflict in Ukraine? I remember during his campaign, he seemed unsure about continuing to provide military aid.
Yeah, and that's a major point of contention. Cutting off military aid to Ukraine would have enormous consequences.
Yeah.
For the balance of power in Europe, it would send a message that the U.S. is retreating from its global commitments.
Right.
And that could embolden Russia to be even more aggressive.
That sounds like a risky move.
It is.
To say the least.
Yeah.
And what about China? Trump's been pretty vocal about his concerns with China's growing power.
Well, his relationship with China has always been tense.
Yeah.
He's accused them of unfair trade practices, intellectual property theft, manipulating their currency. And he's not shying away from confrontation in his second term.
The article mentioned something about raising tariffs on Chinese goods even higher. Didn't he already impose some pretty hefty tariffs during his first term?
He did, and now he's talking about raising those tariffs to as much as 60%.
60%.
He's even hinted at the possibility of going as far as 200% if China makes any aggressive moves towards Taiwan.
200%.
Yeah.
That sounds almost unthinkable.
Yeah.
What would that kind of trade war do to the global economy?
It would be incredibly disruptive. We could see skyrocketing prices,
Wow.
major supply chain disruptions, and a significant slowdown in global economic growth. It's a dangerous game of chicken.
It sounds like Trump's foreign policy could lead to increased tension with both our allies and our rivals.
Yeah.
Are there any countries he's actually looking to build stronger relationships with?
Interestingly enough, an article mentions a potential shift towards closer alignment with the BRICS nations.
The BRICS nations.
Yeah, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa.
I'm not really familiar with that term, to be honest.
They're a group of major emerging economies that are challenging the U.S.'s dominance on the global stage.
Okay.
They're increasingly cooperating on economic and political issues.
Interesting.
And some experts believe they could eventually form a powerful bloc that rivals the West.
So why would Trump want to get closer to them, especially considering his adversarial relationship with China?
It's complicated. He may see them as valuable partners in pushing back against what he sees as unfair trade practices by Europe and other traditional allies.
I see.
He's also expressed interest in negotiating with these countries as they explore alternatives to the U.S. dollar.
Alternatives to the U.S. dollar.
As the world's reserve currency.
Wow, that sounds like a major shift.
It could be. The U.S. dollar has been the dominant currency for decades, but as these BRICS nations gain economic power, they're looking for ways to reduce their reliance on the dollar.
Okay.
If Trump aligns more closely with them, it could accelerate that trend and potentially weaken the dollar's global standing.
So we've got potential conflict with China, strained relations with our allies, and a potential shift towards the BRICS nations. It sounds like a pretty volatile mix.
It is. It's difficult to predict with any certainty what will happen.
Yeah.
But one thing's for sure, we're entering a period of heightened geopolitical uncertainty. Trump's America First approach is likely to lead to a more unpredictable and potentially unstable world order.
All this talk about global power shifts and economic uncertainty is making my head spin.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Can we bring it back down to earth for a minute, talk about how these changes might impact specific industries?
Okay.
Who are the potential winners and losers under Trump's policies?
That's a crucial question. Based on the information in the article, it looks like some industries are positioned to benefit from Trump's agenda,
Okay.
while others could face some serious challenges.
Like what?
For example, fossil fuels are likely to see a resurgence.
Really?
Yeah, Trump's a big proponent of energy independence and has pledged to roll back environmental regulations and boost domestic production of oil, gas, and even coal.
So not such good news for renewable energy then.
Unfortunately, that seems to be the case. The article suggests that Trump's administration will likely shift its focus away from wind and solar and prioritize traditional energy sources instead.
Okay.
This could slow down the growth of the renewable energy sector and make it harder for the U.S. to achieve its climate goals.
The article also mentioned a potential boost for manufacturing under Trump. Is that tied to his America First agenda?
Exactly. He wants to bring manufacturing jobs back to the U.S. and is proposing policies to encourage that. He's talking about tax breaks for manufacturers, tariffs on imported goods to protect American companies from foreign competition, and deregulation to lower the cost of doing business.
But haven't many of those manufacturing jobs been lost to automation, not just outsourcing? Can tariffs and tax breaks really reverse that trend?
That's a valid point. It's a complex issue, and there's no quick fix. But the idea is to create a more favorable environment for domestic manufacturing.
Right.
Which could lead to some job growth, even if it's not a complete reversal of the trends we've seen in recent decades.
Okay. What about the financial sector? Wall Street seemed pretty happy about Trump's win.
Yeah, we talked earlier about the Trump trade being back in full swing.
Right.
Investors are betting on a wave of deregulation, which is generally seen as good news for banks and financial institutions.
Can you remind me why deregulation tends to benefit those industries?
Sure. Deregulation often means fewer rules and restrictions on things like lending, investing, and mergers and acquisitions. This can lead to increased profits, but it can also increase risk.
Right, like the 2008 financial crisis.
Exactly. That was partly fueled by deregulation in the mortgage industry.
So there's potential for growth,
yes,
but also potential for instability.
That's exact. And it's important to remember that Wall Street doesn't always have the best interests of Main Street in mind. What's good for big banks and investors isn't always good for the average worker or consumer.
Speaking of winners and losers, the article mentioned something about Trump's own personal finances and legal issues. Did his wealth actually increase after the election?
It seems so. According to the article, his net worth jumped by almost $300 million after his win, largely due to a surge in the value of Trump media shares.
Trump media, is that still a thing?
It is, and it's apparently doing quite well financially.
Wow.
He also has the backing of some big names in the business world,
Like who?
like Carl Icahn and Steven Schwartzman, who are known for their pro-business, pro-growth stances.
So he's doing well financially. What about all those legal battles he was facing? Did those just disappear now that he's back in office?
Not exactly. He's still facing a number of serious legal challenges,
No.
including federal charges related to the 2020 election and the handling of classified documents.
I remember hearing about the possibility of him pardoning himself. Is that even legal?
That's a huge constitutional question. No president has ever attempted it before. So it would be uncharted territory. Some legal scholars believe he has the authority to pardon himself, while others argue that it would be a blatant abuse of power and potentially unconstitutional.
Right.
If you were to try it, it would almost certainly trigger a massive legal battle that could end up in the Supreme Court.
Okay. This is a lot to process. We've covered so much today. Yeah. So much to process. It feels like Trump's second term could be even more tumultuous than his first.
It's certainly shaping up that way.
Mm.
But it's important to remember that we're just looking at potential scenarios.
Right.
Based on the information we have right now. Things can change quickly in politics, so we need to stay informed
Yeah, that's true.
and be ready to adapt.
You're right about that. I'm still thinking about those tariffs
Yeah.
and how they could impact everyday people. You know, the article mentioned that they could add $2,600
Right.
to the average household's expenses each year.
Mm.
Can you help us understand what types of things might actually get more expensive?
Sure. Think about the things we buy from other countries every day. Electronics, clothing, cars, food, pretty much everything. If those tariffs go into effect, the cost of all those imported goods will likely go up.
Yeah.
And those costs will be passed on to us as consumers.
Right.
You'll probably see higher prices at the grocery store when you're shopping for clothes, even when you fill up your gas tank.
And what about businesses? How will these tariffs affect them?
It depends on the business. Some businesses, especially those that focus on making things here in the U.S.,
Okay.
might actually benefit from the tariffs because they'll face less competition from companies overseas.
Right.
But other businesses that rely on getting supplies from all over the world
Yeah.
could see their costs go way up, which could mean they have to raise prices for consumers or even lay off workers.
So it's kind of a mixed bag
It
with potential winners and losers.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything in the article that gives us a sense of how people are feeling about all of these changes?
Yeah, the article points out that Trump supporters are excited about the possibility of a stronger economy, lower taxes, and a more assertive America on the world stage. They're hoping that his policies will lead to more prosperity and make America more powerful globally.
And what about the people who aren't so thrilled about Trump's second term? What are their main concerns?
Well, they're worried about things like inflation, trade wars, and the rising cost of living.
Yeah.
They argue that his policies are too risky,
Okay.
too focused on short-term gains, and could actually end up hurting the economy and our relationships with other countries.
So basically it's a big gamble
It is.
with high stakes for everyone.
That's one way to look at it. And it's a gamble that we're all going to be watching unfold in the years ahead.
Well, that just about wraps up our deep dive into what Trump's second term could mean for you.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot of ground today, but I want to leave you with a final thought. The article we discussed paints a picture of potential economic growth, but it also highlights the real risks of inflation and trade wars.
For sure.
So here's a question for you. How do you feel about those trade-offs? Are you willing to accept the risks in exchange for the potential rewards? It's a complex issue with no easy answers,
It is.
but it's something we all need to consider as we navigate the uncertainties of the next 4 years.
And remember, staying informed is more important than ever. Keep up with the news. Do your own research.
Yeah,
Talk to people who have different perspectives.
good advice.
That's the best way to understand these complicated issues and be prepared for whatever comes next.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the potential implications of Trump's second term. Until next time, stay curious and stay informed.